It is hard to know the moment a dream is born. We will never know the first time a woman thought about studying Torah, the first time a woman thought about laying tefillin. It will never be possible to know the first time a woman thought about studying to become a rabbi.
A healing service begins with words of thanksgiving, bringing our attention to that which is just fun.
But the thought of one became the thoughts of many, and today there are female rabbis throughout the world. Although the road for women's inclusion in the rabbinate has been a long one, female rabbis are no longer an anomaly. Currently, more than 600 women are rabbis serving the global Jewish community. Certainly, that was not always the case. Although the Bible refers to Devorah as a prophetess and judge, women, until relatively recently, have been excluded from that role, though there were many precursors. One of those was Rachel Ray Frank, born in San Francisco in 1862. She began to speak at congregations throughout the country, being heralded as a latter-day Devorah, the press even dubbing her the Girl Rabbi of the Golden West. Another predecessor at the turn of the century was Hadassah's founder, Henrietta Zold. Solomon Schechter allowed her to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary after she assured him that she would not pursue ordination. On the other side of the world, in Berlin in 1930, Regina Jonas was being privately ordained and became a guest preacher, religious teacher, and chaplain until she perished in Theresienstadt. During the same period in the United States, women in their role of rebbitzin, or rabbis' wives, were exploring ways to express their learning and commitment to a leadership role.
Many of these rabbis' wives had strong Jewish educations. Many of them had graduated from this institution, from the Teachers Institute, which was one of the few places where women could get an advanced Jewish studies degree. As rabbis' wives, they gained an immediate audience for their talents. They gained a community, a congregation of sorts. So many of these women served as the rabbis of their sisterhoods.
Yet many women who desired an even larger scholarly role and the right of ordination were met with the reticence of the Jewish community to include them. Not until the latter part of the 20th century would the issue of women's ordination be resolved.
The ordination question should really be put into the context of modern Jewish history. The first accommodation that Judaism needs to make is the extension of equal education to young Jewish women. The second accommodation is the admission of women to positions of communal and political leadership. And the third accommodation that Judaism needed to make was the admission of women to the religious arena of the synagogue. The status of women in the synagogue takes on different forms. Mixed seating, for example. Men and women sit together in the synagogue. That was a dramatic change in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. The calling of women to read from Scripture, from Torah, in the worship service was another accommodation. The inclusion of women in the religious quorum, the minyan of the synagogue. The final question in this religious arena is could women serve as religious leaders? That was the ordination question. It came along when it did because so many of the other issues, political leadership, equal education, had already been worked through.
Put your arm around it, and that way when we get over here we're in the right direction. And
Sally Priesand was the first woman ordained at Reform Judaism's Hebrew Union College in 1972.
by a quirk of history, I was the first. I was in the right place at the right time. There were 35 men in my class and me.
Rabbi Priesand has spent the last 25 years as the congregational rabbi in Tinton Falls, New Jersey.
I didn't think about being a pioneer, and I didn't go into the rabbinate to champion women's rights. I went into the rabbinate just to be a congregational rabbi.
You're going to become a bar bat mitzvah. This is a big responsibility. You're going to stand.
In 1974, Sandy Eisenberg Sasso became the first woman ordained by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College.
I really didn't think I was doing anything that extraordinary. The time seemed to be ripe. It was the beginnings of the secular feminist movement. There seemed to be interest in women taking on roles they had never taken before.
Since that time, she and her husband, Rabbi Dennis Sasso, have served jointly at Indianapolis's Congregation Beth El Tzedek, where they have recently celebrated their 25th anniversary with the temple. Rabbi Eisenberg Sasso, a prolific author of children's books, brings a woman's perspective to biblical stories.
Women have moved the tradition in new directions. I think they bring certain questions to the text, the sacred text. For example, who was Lot's wife? Here's a woman with no name, and not a very pleasant story. You know, a story of a woman who can't pay attention to the rules, who disobeys God and turns into a pillar of salt. Well, when a woman reads that story, it's a different story. I've retold that story to say that Lot's wife, whose name is Edith, turned out of compassion for her daughters that were following her and for life that was destroyed. And the pillar of salt was her tears. Now, if there were no women in the rabbinate, would someone have told that story? I don't think so.
While the Reform and Reconstructionist movements of Judaism had begun ordaining women on the basis of changing social norms, the conservative movement, which has a commitment to halakha, or Jewish law, was struggling with the decision whether or not to ordain women. Women began to press the issue at both the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Rabbinical Assembly, the International Association of Conservative Rabbis.
In 1977, at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention, a resolution was introduced calling on the seminary to admit women to the program for ordination. As a result of the discussions and debates at that convention, it was decided to form a commission that would study this issue. So the Commission for the Study of the Ordination of Women as Rabbis was born. I was a faculty member at the seminary then and was appointed by Chancellor Gerson Cohen to be the executive director of that commission, which consisted of 14 people altogether.
As discussions began to become much more common among all of us about the possibility of ordaining women, I became more and more interested in what I felt was a vital change that we needed to make in our movement. We needed to hear the woman's voice in both response to our texts and to our changing religious life.
In 1979, although the Commission's report supported the ordination of women, fear of the divisive nature of a vote caused the motion to be tabled. Many thought the issue would not come up again for 50 years. But a scant 4 years later, the vote was brought forth and passed. The Jewish Theological Seminary, primarily through the legal analysis of Rabbi Joel Roth, moved to ordain women.
What finally made it acceptable to the majority of the faculty was, 1, a demonstration that there is no halachic source which forbids granting the woman the title of rabbi. 2, that there is ample halachic evidence that a woman could render legal decisions and her decisions be valid and binding, particularly if she is accepted by those who turn to her as their authority. 3, that there was a way to allow women who obligated themselves for the commandments for which they were otherwise exempt, there was a way to consider them equally obligated with the males who were already obligated by the legal system for those commandments. And once they had that legal equality of obligation, they could count in a quorum which is defined as a quorum of the equally obligated. Once they can count in the quorum, they may also serve as the agents of that quorum. Those issues were more or less resolved by the faculty of the seminary.
It was an amazing day. I mean, the feeling that we were right there as history was being made, just the excitement of being able to be part of this history being changed, that this change would have an effect on Judaism for the future.
In 1985, Amy Eilberg became the first woman ordained in the conservative movement.
My passion was for Talmud, and not coincidentally, Talmud was and is the core of the rabbinical school curriculum. There were a number of us, I called us the backlog women, who had been studying in the graduate school at the seminary for a number of years during the years before the seminaries were letting women in. We were studying those things because that was our passion. And for some of us, it was conscious that we were preparing ourselves for the rabbinate, whether or not the seminary was ready as soon as we were. The chancellor at the time, Gershon Cohen, alav shalom, who early on was opposed to the ordination of women, but then had really a remarkable turnaround and was a wonderful mentor and support to me.
Rabbi Amy Eilberg.
It was a kind of an extraordinary opportunity and an incredible just accident of history that I happened to be the one who ended up being the first as the fruit of the work of many, many people. And so I happened to be in the center of the celebration that was shared by so many of those people who knew that this needed to happen.
This beginning will not be an easy one. We will need to draw on all of our strengths and to turn to each other for support in moments of triumph and despair. Most of all, we will depend on God to grant us the courage to face the many challenges that lie ahead.
Today, Rabbi Eilberg is the co-director of Yedidia, a center for spiritual direction. But if the conservative, reform, and reconstructionist movements of Judaism have chosen to include women in the rabbinate, the Orthodox movement has not.
The central challenge of Judaism in modern times is the role of women, because it impacts on every aspect of Judaism. This sort of construct which the community has created, which it calls the rabbinate, consists of this multitude of components, and some of those components are viewed as appropriate for men and not for women. It is perfectly appropriate for a woman to be a Jewish teacher, a teacher of Judaism. It is perfectly permissible for a woman to be a judge as well. On the other hand, it is not appropriate for a woman to lead services in the synagogue. It is not permissible for women to read from the Torah and have aliyot.
You can't expect things to change overnight. And I'm amazed that so much has changed within Orthodoxy in the last 25 years. To me, 25 years is the blink of an eye as Jews count time. And it's quite remarkable to think of where we were 25 years ago without a rupture within the community.
Women are embracing the full multiplicity of roles in the rabbinate. In addition to her congregational duties, Rabbi Paula Winnig works as a prison chaplain.
This week's Torah portion is Chaye Sarah, which means the life of Sarah. And instead of actually it being about her life, it's really about her death. There's lots of interesting things in this portion, including the first purchase in the land of Israel for Sarah's burying spot. But also, I thought it was a good opportunity to talk about the women of the Bible in general.
Rabbi Joanna Samuels of Congregation Habonim in New York City teaches an adult study class.
Vayelech Avram ka'asher diber elav Adonai vayelech itolat, right? So Abraham went, right? God says, Lech lecha vayelech Avram.
Rabbi Adina Lewides oversees the rededication of a Torah.
May you really be led to Yerushalayim, to not just Yerushalayim on earth, but Yerushalayim, the heavenly Jerusalem, a place of love and peace and blessing always.
But even as each rabbi finds her niche, equality of women in the rabbinic role is not yet fully realized. A recent survey by the Rabbinical Assembly dealt with even more specific employment issues.
We're in a time of transition, and transitions are really, really hard. There is at the moment not a single woman who is a rabbi of the largest category of the D congregations, the largest size conservative congregations in the country. There's also a big disparity in pay. And another fascinating difference is the percentage of married women in the rabbinate is much lower than the percentage of married men in the rabbinate. So all of these issues are out there, needing to be explored and needing to be thought through.
We knew intuitively that there was a glass ceiling in the conservative rabbinate. There is a process of social change taking place. That can't be dictated from above. It can be advocated, but it can't be dictated.
Despite the persisting problems, many women are eager to be ordained, like Nicole Guzik, who has just begun the long road to the rabbinate.
So, said Rabbi Abahu, what I'm most excited about learning here at JTS is a woman's place in Jewish law. This is the first time that I've ever had the chance to study women in halakha, or really women's absence in the Talmud. How can I find a personal attachment to the text that I'm reading every day? I know that I can find that meaning, but I also know it's going to take many years to find that personal connection.
Blessed is the Lord our God, ruler of the universe.
Now, decades later, it is clear that the decision to include women in the rabbinate has had an enormous effect on both the rabbinate and American Judaism.
May we show our gratitude to you by leading our daughter in the way of righteousness.
In the past 30 years, we've seen a flowering of rituals for the birth of a baby girl, for example, thinking about women's development, thinking about the religious meaning of the onset of menses and of menopause, the beginning and end of women's reproductive years. And when I first got involved in the question of what should be Jewish rituals for miscarriage and other pregnancy losses, at first I heard male rabbis much older than myself say, I've been in the rabbinate for decades and I've never have heard this question before. And I had been in the rabbinate just for a couple of years and I heard this question a lot. So that's an interesting example of how women's presence clearly brought these kinds of issues to the fore.
There are two very powerful messages being conveyed by gathering this morning to complete the writing of a Sefer Torah in honor of Juliet's bat mitzvah.
Judaism has become more vibrant, more creative, by virtue of the inclusion of women in the equation. You just have more brain power, you have more spirit, you have more creativity at work here.
So there are many, many names for God, at least 100 names for God. I think of the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. Jacob didn't really invite the angel to wrestle, but Jacob encountered the angel and he had to wrestle with it until it blessed him. That's actually a good image for how I understand women and Judaism. I think they have been wrestling with the tradition for probably over 3 decades, and perhaps for more than that. They've been wrestling with the tradition, and they're not going to let it go until it blesses them.